Hello, my name is Christy Smith. This week's reading assignment went over some very important topics. This presentation will discuss racism and sexism and briefly discuss stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Kaysen states in the text, we are all targets of other people's stereotypes and prejudices. These may be based on how we look, how we talk, how we dress, where we come from, and so on. Racism. Racism is prejudice and discrimination based on a person's racial background or institutional and cultural practices. It promotes the domination of one racial group over another. People are racially malevolent according to Kaysen and the other authors. Most people want to see themselves as fair, but still have anxiety about other racial groups. The book calls them germs because they lurk beneath the surface and their existence can have a profound effect on us. Modern racism is a subtle form of prejudice that tends to surface when it is safe, social, acceptable, and easy to rationalize. Adversive racism is racism that concerns the ambivalence between fair-minded attitudes and beliefs on the one hand, and unconscious and unrecognized prejudicial feelings and beliefs on the other. The book states that several studies have been found that white participants playing the role of jurors may be more likely to convict a black person than a white person for a crime when the evidence is rather ambiguous, and thus one can justify either a guilty or not guilty verdict for reasons having nothing to do with race. Implicit racism, that's racism that operates unconsciously and unintentionally. Anthony Greenwald and others developed a test called implicit association test. This test measures the extent that two concepts are associated by comparing how quickly participants associated African American cues with negative or positive concepts compared to how quickly they associated European American cues with these same concepts. If the person is consistently slower identifying something good after seeing a black face than a white face, that would indicate a degree of implicit racism. There are many anxieties and challenges associated with intergroup interactions and are not just limited to white and black. Gay, lesbian, overweight people, and other social categories deal with these challenges as well. The next is sexism. Sexism is a prejudice or discrimination based on a person's gender or as institutional and cultural practices that promote the domination of one gender. The book talks about ambivalence sexism being a form of sexism characterized by attitudes about women that reflect both negative, resentful beliefs and feelings and affectionate and chivalrous but potential patronizing feelings and beliefs. Ambivalent sexism consists of two elements, hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. Glick, Fisk, and others conducted a study on 1,500 men and women in 19 nations across 6 continents and found that ambivalent sexism was prevalent around the world. Countries with the greatest degree of economic and political inequalities between sexes tended to be the most hostile and benevolent sexism. Although men are objected in the media to sexism as well, it's still the case that women experience this much more. Stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination all play with sexism and racism. Stereotyping is a belief or association that links whole groups of people with certain traits or characteristics. Prejudice is a consist of negative feelings about others because of their connection to a social group. And discrimination concerns behavior, specifically negative behavior directed against a person or persons because of their membership in a particular group. These can all operate independently, but they often influence and reinforce each other. So where there's one, there's going to be another. With stereotypes, a lot of them that is a pretty big stereotype is gender. Pink usually refers to it's a girl, while blue usually refers to it's a boy. These distinctions go along with kids till they're in college and even as grown men and women. You find that in college, in males, they usually tend to major in economics or science, and females major in arts, language, and humanities. Although pink and blue are not as distinctive today as they once were. Then there's a theory that small gender differences are magnified in perception by contrasting social roles occupied by men and women. According to this theory, perceivers' differences between men and women are based on real behavioral differences that are mistakenly assumed to rise from gender rather than actual social roles. Some of the causes for the problems with sexism and racism and everything, prejudice, discrimination, and all. There's causes for that, and some of the causes are social categorization. That's where the classification of persons into a group on the basis of common attributes. Then you have in-groups versus out-groups. Groups with which an individual feels a sense of membership, belonging, and identity. Out-groups are groups with which an individual does not feel a sense of membership, belonging, or identity. And the out-group homogeneity effect, that's the tendency to assume that there are greater similarities among groups of out-groups than among members of in-groups. Social categorization is natural and adaptive. It allows us to form impressions quickly and use experiences to guide and new interactions. Categorizing people often leads to overestimating the differences between groups and underestimating the differences within a group. The in-groups versus out-groups. we see people in fundamentally different ways if we consider them to be part of our in-group or as part of an out-group. Out-group homogeneity effect is pretty much, in other words, there may be many and subtle differences among us, but they are all alike. For example, people from China, Korea, and Japan see themselves as quite distinct from each other. But to many Westerners, they see them as simply Asian. That goes into stereotyping them as well, and stereotyping blacks and whites, that all blacks are bad, or all whites are bad, or all Puerto Ricans are bad. If they're not in our in group, then we put them in an out group, and they're not part of us. There are ways to reduce the problem. The book talked about several ways. One of the ways is contact hypothesis. This is a theory that direct contact between hostile groups will reduce intergroup prejudice under certain conditions. There's four conditions that are deemed ideal for intergroup contact to serve as treatment for racism. One is equal status, personal contact, cooperative activities, and social norms. That's putting everybody on the same playing field. There's another way that was called the jigsaw classroom. It's a cooperative learning method used to reduce racial prejudice through interaction in a group effort. I found this to be very interesting. This method produced impressive results, according to the book. The material to be learned within each group was divided into subtopics. Each student was responsible for learning one piece of the puzzle. Everyone, regardless of race and ability or self-confidence, needed everyone else to succeed. So they all had to work together pretty much whether they wanted to or not. In closing, prejudice and discrimination operate not only on an individual level, in which anyone can be both a perpetrator or a target, but also on institutional and cultural levels, which involve practices that promote the domination of one group over another within your work area or within your culture. Stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination today often operate implicitly without conscious intent or awareness on the part of perceivers, but it has significant consequences. The two questions that I came up with were, how can we measure how implicit bias someone is? I think it's important to know how implicit bias you are so that you can be conscious of how you're being prejudiced or discriminating against someone without even knowing it. And the second question is, how can Christians respond when faced with racism or sexism? And are there scripture to support what Christ tells us? How, as a Christian, we should be self-conscious about how we treat other people, because the Bible tells us that we are to treat everyone Christ-like. We're supposed to act Christ-like. So Christ did not walk the earth showing that he was prejudiced against the Jews or the Gentiles or the Palestinians or whoever else. Everyone was the same for him, which it should be for us too. So that goes back with us learning how to know and measure our implicit biasness so that we can get ourselves in check and be able to start making a bigger impact on the world.